Welcome back to Richard II Live, and it's the moment that you have all been waiting for. I am delighted right now to welcome to the studio star of the production himself, the fantastic David Tennant, and artistic director of the RSC and director of Richard II, Greg Doran. Thank you so much for coming in today and joining us live to the nation's schools.
It's very exciting. Nice to be here.
And further afield as well.
Yeah.
We are abroad. This is global. We've had loads of questions coming in thick and fast. So without any further ado, should we kick off with the first question?
Let's do it.
Should we dive in? All right. Well, let's go to South Lanarkshire first. This is a question from Hamilton College from Jane Cook. And she asks, was the fact that the script was written in verse easier or more difficult for the lines to be learned?
It's a bit of both, really. I suppose because you've got that iambic pentameter, you've got these 10 beats in every line, so you kind of know that there are 10 syllables in every line that you come to.
You get into the rhythm.
So you do get into the rhythm, and a lot of it rhymes as well. So as you're memorising, you're often kind of making those links in your head. But then, of course, if a bit drops out of your brain, you can't. It's harder to
pick up.
Fudge, yeah, because that rhythm is so strong all the way through, and it's the only Shakespeare play written entirely in verse.
It's the only Shakespeare entirely in verse, I think. Yeah. And I think the verse, also the rhymes, give you a kind of forward momentum. It keeps you moving forward. And because rhyme also makes you wonder what the rhyme is going to be, it's very playful and very alive, I think.
Because it can feel at first quite artificial in a way, that every line is de-dum, 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 de-dum. But there's something about, if you're quite strict with yourself about just trying to make every thought last that long, then there's something quite conversational about it eventually, I think, as well.
I think the whole idea of that,
sort of gobbets.
Yeah, you get into the beat almost, and then
there's nothing too complicated. I mean, I want to go and get a cup of tea is a perfect iambic pentameter line. It just goes de-dum, 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 and it's like a heartbeat that goes through the whole play. Sometimes the heartbeat quickens, and sometimes it stops suddenly. But if you don't preserve that sense of that forward momentum, the play begins to sort of drift a bit.
Yeah, you have to keep in the flow.
Yeah.
And I guess also that stops, sometimes in productions and with script you can get clunky lines, but you wouldn't really get any clunky lines because you're sticking to that flow, really.
It keeps you pushing forward. Sometimes it can be very funny as well, because the audience, as you're watching it, as an audience member, without even realising it, that rhythm, you're very aware of the rhythm, and then he'll put in a little funny rhyme sometimes, you know.
Yeah, definitely. The rhythm can help with the comedy. Yeah. Good question. Thank you very much. That was from Jane Cook. Okay, here's another one for both of you, actually. This is from Mrs. Johnson, a teacher, I believe. Crosley Heath in Halifax. What other portrayals of Richard II did you take inspiration from?
My own personal journey with Richard II began a long time ago in Stratford-upon-Avon, when two famous actors, Ian Richardson and Richard Pascoe, alternated the roles of Bolingbroke and Richard, and it was a very famous production. And a rather nice thing happened in the was it the dress rehearsal, the first preview?
No, there was the press night, our opening night. Yeah.
Ian Richardson's widow sent David the ring that he had worn when he played Richard back. You know, that is now 40 years ago. Yeah. And you wore it, in fact.
You'll have seen it in the show today, yeah. I wore the ring that I wear in the list scene, where Bolingbroke and Mowbray are facing off each other. That's the ring that was worn in 1973 by Ian Richardson. Yeah.
That's a good bit of trivia.
Bit of theatrical history for you.
Yeah, good knowledge to know. Right, David, this one is for you, from Catherine Byron, who's from St Luke's Primary School in Glossop. And she wants to know, while the performance is taking place, what's it like to be backstage?
Well, it depends what you're doing. It depends, you know, once it starts, there's a kind of machine that cranks into motion. There's dressers who are making sure people are in the right costume for the next bit. There's everybody flying around backstage, getting to the right side of the stage that they need to be on. Yep. People preparing for the next bit, people nervously pacing around. If people have longer time off, they retreat to the staff canteen and have a cup of tea.
Really?
And, yeah. At the end,
you don't get much time backstage.
I know, but I always go up to.
You don't get a cup of tea,
I go up to the canteen at the interval every night just to check in, and there's always Bushy's always there, usually having a pie. He likes to have a pie at the interval. And then on Merle and one of the ladies in waiting. That's usually the gang that are in the green room at the interval that I hang out with for about 10 minutes every night. So everyone has their own little sequence that they go into.
It's
Yeah,
quite
their
funny because in
routine.
Stratford too, they do the quick changes around the back of the auditorium as well.
Yeah.
And there's one bit where they're changing into the armour for the list scene, and they're
Very
very
quietly.
quietly putting on this
Oh, 'cause
really
it's so
heavy
clinking
metal
and
armour.
metal.
Yeah.
Ah, I see. And I guess once the performance has started, you're on the clock, and that's a real adrenaline buzz as well that helps the.
Yeah,
the
it's
whole-
absolutely once the stage manager calls it and the show starts, everyone has their own personal sequence, and there's no the train is on the track. There's no stopping.
Yeah, fantastic. So exciting. Greg, this one is for you. What was the most challenging part of directing a production for live broadcast? And that's from Emma Jones at Chiswick School. your neck
Chiswick,
of the
hello
woods.
Chiswick School.
David hails from Chiswick.
I suppose the most difficult thing was working out what you wanted the camera to be on, because the simplest thing is whoever's speaking, you put the camera on them.
Yeah.
But I mean, I have to say, I had a fantastic director, a television director with me, Robin Luff, who we worked through the whole of the script together. And there'd be times when I'd go, yes, he's speaking at that point, but at that point, Richard and Mowbray are having a very significant, glance between
Yep.
them that's unspoken,
That's it.
and we need to get
Yep.
that reaction, and we need to get that shot. And he also introduced a crane into the camera. So we had cameras on either side of the stage. We had a tracking camera, and we had this huge crane. So when Richard appears on the bridge at Flint Castle, and he comes down at Flint Castle, this crane could go all the way up and take a close-up at Flint Castle. So sometimes we tried all the shots first of all, because we did 2 rehearsals in the theatre, one with and one without an audience.
Yeah.
And I felt that the camera at one point was taking too long to come in on a shot of David doing the Hollow Crown speech.
Right.
And that somehow we needed to be closer in earlier. So that was a negotiation to say, let's have that tracking shot, but let's cut it at that point and move into a more of a closer mid-shot. And all these terms, mid-shot and close-up and tracking, as a theatre director, I don't know what these mean, but it was very exciting to find those out. And I suppose what we're aiming for is that the live from Stratford screening or the streaming that you've seen this morning is like both being in the theatre on the back row so you can see the whole stage, and having a front row seat. So you get the close-up and the long shot, if you like.
I suppose if you as an audience member in a theatre, you can choose who to look at any given moment.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, as a cast and as a director, we're kind of trying to guide you in the way that we present it, but
Look at me.
yeah. But whereas in a film or television, the camera's cutting and showing you. So even if, as you say, it's not always the person who's speaking that the story's about at that moment. So I guess it's trying to find a mid-ground between the two.
And sometimes, as a director, you try and guide the audience to where to look, and sometimes you misdirect them because you don't want them to look in another direction. And what was interesting about doing it for screen was that you could say, no, you will look there. I need you to catch this line and what this person thinks about that line. So that was quite interesting, because in the theatre, especially in a 3D space like the thrust stage, it's difficult to direct all those people to look in the same direction at the same time.
Yeah, and I guess as well with close-up shots, you get a different type of intimacy than if you're just on the front row. So were there things that you felt like you almost had to tweak or change for the filming?
Well, I mean, that was an interesting question that all the actors had, was because there was a live audience when we were filming it, the actors really had to play to the house, and I had to make sure that whatever shots we weren't going to go in too close, because otherwise you get that really difficult thing. You know that shot in Jaws where they home in on Roy Schneider when he sees the shark, and they pull out at the same time. It's kind of double zoom. I don't know what the thing is.
Look it up on YouTube. It's very
Look, but it's a great moment, because what the danger was that we would go too close, say on David while he was hitting the back wall of the
because
RST
it's a
stage.
different type of acting. I think that's all us actors were a little bit nervous because in a theatre it's a bit amplified. You know, you're sort of banging it out there, and you have to tell the story in slightly bigger. Well, your gestures have to be bigger. You have to talk louder. You know, you have to spit a bit more to get to be heard at the back. So, and you wouldn't do that if you were making a piece of TV or a film. So it took a bit of getting used to, I think, for everyone.
We never went in on really close, tight shots because that would be sort of unfair in a way because the scale of acting is different, and it isn't. We aren't making a film. We're showing a live performance of a stage performance.
It's interesting. You had to take on two disciplines and sort of find a good compromise to make sure it worked on both levels. Right, better press on through all the questions. We've had so many. It's hard not to get, go really deep into these. Tom Chadwick from Notre Dame wants to know, what qualities did you focus on to make Richard appealing to a modern audience?
He's sort of not appealing.
That's one of the things. He, especially in the first half, he's quite unlikable.
He's a kind of, he's childish. He stamps his feet. He is willful. He's capricious. He's all these things. But then Shakespeare does a very clever thing. He twists he shifts your. You begin to think Bolingbroke's the great guy, and then you begin to go, well, maybe he's not so great. And Richard becomes more sympathetic. I think Richard becomes a bigger person as his fall happens, in a way.
And the fact that you dislike Richard in the first half makes you all the more sorry for him, in a way, in the second half.
Well, because he gains an understanding, to an extent anyway, he gains an understanding of how much he got wrong, I think. And
It's quite funny being as monstrous as he is too, so there's something quite appealing about that.
Well, it's quite appealing, isn't it, when someone you dislike is knocked down. And
there's that too.
Absolutely. Right, Chris Davidson from Lincoln Castle Academy wants to know, do you feel your vision brings something new and exciting to Richard II?
Well, obviously we do.
Yeah, you're not going to say no.
You can't begin a Shakespeare play by thinking this is going to be the definitive production of a Shakespeare play, of this Shakespeare play. All you can do is begin with a really good team of actors, and then what you do happens in the rehearsal room, now. So it's about now because we are in 2013. So we're using our own understanding of the text. We've changed it. There is a very particular bit that some people might have noticed, which is that in Shakespeare's text, the character that kills Richard is a character called Sir Piers Exton, but we have made O'Merle the person who assassinates Richard. And that's because we felt that in reading the historical accounts that Sir Piers Exton was somehow, there was something fishy about him, that he doesn't appear in history. He seems to have been a fabrication. And so he's made up. So we decided that it felt more rational that O'Merle, who's trying to work out how you work in this new court under Henry IV, that he thinks the king has given him the wink to say, prove you true to my new regime and you'll do well. So he thinks what the king means is go and kill Richard II.
Yeah. It does make sense, though, that it's a male. We did develop a theory in rehearsals that actually that's what Shakespeare always meant.
Yeah.
And that for some reason, now lost in the mist of history, that perhaps he was politically encouraged to change it. It does make, because of all the stuff with O'Merle in this
Shakespeare a service here.
Exactly, yeah, we're restoring it to how it's meant to be, I'm sure. The bit where O'Merle comes before the king and has to sort of, he was going to betray him and now he won't, and now he'll be a good boy. It just makes sense that he pushes on and does the deed. And of course, it's all the more distressing that the two people have been so close are sort of ripped apart.
It gets a fantastic gasp in the audience every night when he pulls back the balaclava and it's O'Merle there killing him. It's a very sad moment. I think if it was just a character that had been introduced in the previous scene,
Yeah, it wouldn't have
wouldn't be
that
very,
impact.
wouldn't be, yeah.
Absolutely right. After stating that Richard was a complex character in interview, how did you both finally agree on portraying the character? And that's from Fiona Augustia, who's from Penwith College in Penzance.
Well, I think by being excited by the fact that it is complicated. I mean, they're the more interesting characters to play. If he was very straightforward, if you could understand all his motivations straight off, then there's nothing to
Grab
there's nothing to
onto.
enjoy in rehearsals. There's nothing to entice an audience with. I think you look for those contradictions. You look for the things in a character that aren't immediately sympathetic or that don't immediately necessarily make sense. And that's when drama's exciting, when you're hopefully showing characters that are a bit complicated and unknowable and a bit surprising.
Did you both agree sort of on the portrayal from the beginning, or did you sort of work it out together, or did it
not
evolve?
that I kind of
through
remember.
It's an
rehearsal?
unfolding process,
It
isn't it?
is. I mean, I think there's a big decision, first of all, which is, A, does David want to play Richard II? And, we've worked together before on Hamlet and Love's Labour's Lost and 2 comedies in the West End. And it's, so in a way, casting David and David agreeing to play the part is a sort of contract, but it's not a decision about how the part should be played. It's the beginning of a conversation about what is the character and how does that character work. And sometimes the contradictions that David's talking about are what make the character exciting, because it's a bit like sometimes Richard seems to be one thing in one scene and another thing in another scene. And I think Shakespeare builds characterization a bit like beads on a necklace, that he can be a bright blue bead in this scene, a bright yellow bead in that scene, a bright red bead. But when you thread them all together, you get a great necklace. But if you kind of go, I think he's a bit red here, but he should be a bit yellow, and try, it becomes a very muddy performance. Whereas I think what David does is make absolutely each scene, he's very particular to what he is in that scene. And you, the audience, provide the string in the necklace, if you like.
Yeah.
What a complicated
Nice
metaphor.
I
analogy.
like that.
Yeah,
I
very
like that analogy.
Yeah.
Very good. Now, some of our viewers will have seen there was a VT on the design of the production, and Catherine Flanagan from Mount Sackville wants to know, how did you work with the designer to decide on the sets and the whole look of the play?
We made a decision. With any Shakespeare play, you've got a series of choices. We could have decided to do it modern dress. Which is, after all, how Shakespeare would have done it himself. He did it in Elizabethan costume, which was modern dress for him. Or you could look back to 1399, when the play is set, which is 200 years before Shakespeare. So we decided that really what Shakespeare's doing with Richard II is writing a play about a king who lived 200 years before, a medieval king, but he's talking about his own period. So it is a metaphor. It's a medieval metaphor for his own time. And what we decided was to retain that medieval metaphor, because on one level the play is about, a medieval, the fall of a medieval king, but it's also on another level very much a play for today. It's about a ruler who has a strong grip on power, who thinks he's got a God-given right to rule, and of other people who think he should be shaken from that rule for the good of the Commonwealth, as it were. And there are lots of people all over the world who fit that description today.
Yeah.
So by sometimes if you put a play in modern dress, you can heighten the parallels, but you can also cloud them. That you can think, why are they doing this play in modern dress and talking about jousts? The jousting scene would be very difficult to do in a modern context, I guess. There are lots of knights in armour and throwing gauges down. Well, we don't throw gauges down. We don't challenge each other.
You'd have to find
like
some
that.
other modern
You would.
metaphor
I'm
for
sure
it.
you could. But
Yes.
we chose to retain that medieval metaphor. And Stephen Brimson Lewis, the designer, we went together with the whole company to Westminster Hall, which is right there in Parliament, underneath Big Ben. And it's the hall that actually Richard II himself had built, or had rebuilt. and it has an amazing, huge hammer beam roof and extraordinary angels, and all of Richard's insignia are still there. And that is where great parliamentarians or great public figures often lie in state when they're about to be buried. Before their funeral, they're put in there. Churchill was put in there. And that actually gave us the cue for the whole of the first scene, Westminster Hall, which Stephen then rendered as this extraordinary projection onto chain. And we start the whole play actually with the lying in state rather, of the Duke of Gloucester.
Got you. Mrs. Johnson from Crosley Heath wants to know, how did you get into character for playing Richard II?
You mean every night, or sort of more generally? Kind of
Both.
both.
She hasn't specified.
Right, well, Mrs. Johnson. You need to be more specific next time. See me. It's just, well, I suppose, like we've been saying, it's what you do through rehearsals. It's you come to the play, I suppose, with ideas, and then you start reading it, and you start rehearsing it. You start working with other actors, and as you start doing the scenes up on your feet, things occur to you, and things seem. And when you play the scenes with other actors, it starts to feel a certain way, and it starts to encourage you in certain directions. It's a sort of evolving thing.
We had one quite interesting rehearsal where we decided to sort of, if you like, physicalize Richard's resistance to the news that keeps coming, all the bad news, saying, you know, everybody's left you, and all the troops are disappearing. You're on your own. And the last person to come in with the worst news, I said to David, why don't you use chairs around the room, anything you can find in the rehearsal room, to sort of protect yourself? And it became a really interesting part of the scene, because he was going, yeah, tell me your news, and putting chairs in, and like creating a wall around him. And that, I felt that was quite useful in a way, because it demonstrated that he's both saying, yes, tell me, and no, I don't want to know.
Yeah.
I guess.
So that you're developing that, and at the same time you're also thinking, well, what's he going to look like? How's that going to feel? How's that going to influence?
Does he have long hair?
Does he have long hair? Sometimes he does. Does he have gold fingernails? You know, is he that sort of a guy? And does he wear armour like the people around him? And we thought, well, actually, no, he's surrounded by big, gruff blokes in armour, but actually he chooses to have rather flighty hair and paint his nails gold, and that says something about his character. And so all these things are sort of contributing, hopefully, to the final picture.
And he's
it builds up.
He's constructing an image of kingship in a way. When his final appearance on Flint Castle, he does a really good job at making himself seem as kingly as it is possible to be.
Richard's got this whole thing about being linked to God, which he talks about all the time. You know, he's God's appointed. He's close to the angels, and that, I think, gives him a sense of otherness, which we try to look for. Which then, of course, everything falls apart, and God doesn't come in to save him, and he's got to then deal with that in the second half. Yeah,
he realises he's deluded. Lincoln Castle Academy School have submitted a question. This one's from Chris Davison. What are some of Richard II's strengths and weaknesses as a character, in your opinions?
I suppose all the things we've been talking about, his single-mindedness is both a strength and a weakness. The fact that he believes he can never be wrong, you could describe as a strength or a weakness, as a virtue or a vice, really, depending on your point of view. He's incredibly eloquent. He's very extremely sort of gifted in terms of expressing himself, but he's perhaps not the world's greatest politician, which is difficult for a man who's supposed to be ruling a country.
And thinks he's godly.
And yes, quite.
And, you know, it was a very dangerous play to put on by Shakespeare under Elizabeth, because there are many parallels between Elizabeth I and Richard II. You know, Elizabeth had no children. She had a disastrous campaign in Ireland. She surrounded herself by a close team of special advisors who she relied on very heavily, and she taxed the population to the point of breaking. And Richard does all those things. And Elizabeth I recognised that this portrait that Shakespeare had painted was very like her, and she famously said, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" And that's, to me, what that says is, it's a very accurate picture, whether that's today in the 21st century or back then in the 16th century. It's a very accurate portrayal of how people cling on to power.
I've got a question here, which is an interesting one. This is from Sackville School in East Grinstead. How does this play reflect and raise questions about the current position of the monarchy within society?
Wow.
Well, I think in a way, it's not so much about the monarchy as about, I mean, there are so many people, I mean, we could easily point to, of course, characters like Mugabe in Zimbabwe who will not relinquish power. And indeed, throughout Syria today, it could be this play could be as much about Syria as it is about medieval England.
Yes, the difference is, I suppose, that our monarchs now don't rule the country.
Yes, the power base.
So that's that. Yes, in a way, you're talking more about a modern-day president or prime minister. But there is still there's interesting questions about this sort of lineage of kings and what that means, and is this something that we've sort of inherited from some past where there is some belief that it's God-given, there's a God-given right to rule, and I
You're
think that
born into it.
You're born into it, and therefore you're right to be there. And then you look at what happened in history, and you go, well, people replaced each other and then decided they were born into it by God. And it's all, these things were all very movable back in the day. So there are interesting questions about.
I suppose there's also the question about how you get power in the first place. And clearly, Henry IV says he's coming back, Bolingbroke says he's coming back just to gain his rights that has been taken away from him, his inheritance to the Duchy of Lancaster, because of his dad. And then very quickly he's going, but wait a minute, maybe I should be king. And nobody said you should be king. It's extraordinary that he sees his power. And it's such a rocky basis for his reign that at the end, when we have Richard's, I guess, ghost appear above him in that final shot, you sort of know that his reign is going to be haunted by the fact that he illegally deposed Richard II.
And interesting, we got to tour around Westminster Abbey, and we were taken into the room where Henry IV died. And on the roof, there's all these Richard II's insignia on the roof. So Henry IV died in a room looking up at Richard II's symbols looking down on him. So he literally was haunted to his death by what he did.
Now, we've got a final question here from St Albans School. Time has just flown by. We'll see if we can get one in after this. This is from Birmingham. How much say did you have about how the play was staged, and did you just do as you were told?
I always do what I'm told. I stand where I'm told, I say the words. Well, I suppose the setting was decided before because you have to, just in terms of putting a theatre production on, you have 6 weeks rehearsal, so things like what the set's going to look like, broadly speaking, are decided before we get there. But then things develop in rehearsals, and things will move around and change. And
I remember when we did Hamlet, which we decided together we were going to do modern dress, and David decided he wanted to wear a Superman T-shirt. And I said, well, maybe not Superman, maybe we'll have a kind of Hercules T-shirt with sort of muscle guy on it. But the next production he wore a Superman T-shirt.
I did a Shakespeare play 2 years later, and I got it in eventually.
Good work. Oh, look, we've got time for some more. Latymer Upper School want to know, Richard is crowned at 10 years old. To what extent do you think this shapes his personality?
Oh, I think it's really instructive, and sometimes you have to be careful about the historical facts contradicting the play you're doing, because ultimately we're doing a play, and we're telling the story that Shakespeare's written down, which will sometimes contradict the historical facts. But the very fact that Richard was crowned at 10 means he never had a normal life. He never had a normal childhood. Which he probably wouldn't as a royal prince anyway, but even more so, from 10 years old, you're God's anointed on earth. And everyone's telling you that. No one will ever say you're wrong. No one will ever tell you not to do anything. I mean, at 10, sometimes you need to be told off.
Not to be a narcissist.
Yes, quite.
And he's crowned at 10 because his father dies, and his father should have been the king, and so he's never has a father. And everybody else in the play, Bolingbroke has John of Gaunt, even Northumberland has Harry Percy. There are all these father-son relationships, York and O'Merle, and he doesn't.
I think it's very instructive as to who Richard is, and because of some of the I think that that's instructive as to some of the mistakes that he makes.
Carrington Community College want to know which of the Shakespeare plays is your favourite.
Richard II.
Well, yeah, of course.
You have to say that now.
It is right now.
Yeah.
It's always the one you're working on.
Yes, absolutely. King Edward the Sixth College. Do you think Shakespeare did the historical character of Richard II justice?
Well, I think Shakespeare has a particular agenda in taking his whole reign and just taking the last fraction of that reign. It's the last year of his reign. And, one has to remember that Richard, at a very, very young age, when he was only a teenager, helped to quell the peasants' revolt. He was very brave and went out and faced a whole a mob of rioting of people. I don't think he's being particularly fair on Richard, but on the other hand, I think Richard was probably wasn't the greatest monarch that Britain has ever had.
There's a lot of evidence to suggest that Richard was losing it a bit in the last couple of years, and certainly Shakespeare plays on that. And there's historically it follows the fact more than many.
More than Richard III, for instance.
Yes, quite. So it's still a piece of drama, and ultimately that he wrote. He wrote a play. He didn't write a piece of history, but it hangs on the facts pretty well.
Okay, just quickly, we've got time for one more. Prince Henry's Grammar School. Do you think Richard was inherently selfish, or do you think he was influenced by others?
Prince Henry is asking that.
Yep. If you're crowned at 10, to be fair,
I think it's hard to have any perspective on what real life should be. I think that's it.
And you need to find close advisors. And if the people you find around you are Bushy, Bagot and Green, that might have been a bad choice.
Or before that, your uncles who are all maybe wondering why they're not king.
Yeah.
I think it would be... He
jealous
was,
of a 10-year-old.
Yeah. I think he was in a very difficult position, and I think I did the best he could under very trying circumstances. I'm on Richard's side.
Yeah, poor Richard.
Well.
Yeah.
And on that note, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for all the questions that have been coming. There have been so many. We've tried to get through lots, but they're so good that we can't help talking and talking when we answer them. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our live broadcast. Of course, we want to say a massive thank you to the hundreds of schools and thousands of students across the UK and the world indeed who have tuned into the production and the event. Our thanks to everyone involved. Our thanks, of course, to our two studio guests here. Have you have anything to add in a nutshell?
I hope everybody's enjoyed it.
Yes.
Yeah. Come back next year for Henry IV Part 1, see what happens next.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If you would like to keep talking to us about the event, email the RSC, education@rsc.org.uk, or after school, why not get on Twitter and use the hashtag RSC Richard II, RSC Richard II. And tell us your thoughts. I had to say that in case you put 2ND. Anyway, that is it from us for now. We hope that your question got answered, or if not, maybe through some of the other questions in the chat, you heard the reply you wanted to hear. And it's goodbye from our guests and goodbye from me. We hope to see you all again soon. Thanks very much. Bye.